about your birth. Heather. That's what you're called now, isn't it?
Wait, I shouldn't have said you reminded me of a guy like that.
Well, maybe if you would compare me to your daughter. That's not what I want.
Not you. Alessa. Your true self.
During my time working at a chain restaurant, I frequently took breaks. I would walk across the parking lot and grab lunch at the mall between shifts. Eating the same food we sold every day was budget-friendly, but it started to wear thin pretty quick. This mall had always had a special place in my memories, bustling with life and excitement since my childhood, but I couldn't help but notice its decline in recent years. While some sections of the mall still buzzed with activity, the signs of its struggle were everywhere. Numerous vacant storefronts, the distant echo of footsteps, and a sense of emptiness that hung in the air. The ambience made it, funnily enough, a quiet escape from work. It provided a quiet sanctuary where I could steal 20 minutes to close my eyes and recharge. I find this a fitting reflection when watching the introduction to Silent Hill 3. Drenched in the amber sunlight, it's one of the most picturesque moments of the series, and let alone the medium of games. It speaks to a specific kind of nostalgia of being a teenager in the early 2000s, the sun setting on childhood, the last precious moments before innocence vanishes. My relationship with the series goes all the way back to the first game. Speaking of, the Silent Hill 1 PS1 case is terrifying for a kid. Imagine you're 9-10 flipping through the collection of games and there is just this. It was difficult to tell what was happening in my underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, but between the M rating, the ghost face, and the haunted looking kid, I was pretty sure this is not something I should play. But I was a curious child, and curled up at the edge of my bed one sleepless night, I slid the disc in. Maybe I was proving my own bravery to myself, or maybe it was morbid curiosity, but I was drawn to it. And that fascination would not loosen its grip, even into adulthood. I did not, unfortunately, make it very far, but I remember the introduction clearly. Mostly because I stole the idea in one of the first short stories I read as a kid, but I digress. Further areas were mysterious and filled with morbid curiosity. And if by some stroke of luck I was able to get through those early sections, I found the rest of the game just fascinating in its aesthetics and sense of horror as I did the introduction. I returned to Silent Hill 1 when I wanted to try and test my ability to handle media outside my comfort zone, but I never managed to finish it. 15 years later, the memory of the first Silent Hill remains this enigmatic, strange piece of horror I never felt brave enough to finish, but whose constituent parts have influenced what I enjoy in art. I avoided Silent Hill as a series until I played Silent Hill 2 a few years later, around when I was a high school freshman. The second game is far removed from the plot of the original, and I don't think much explanation is necessary given the popularity of it. It's a classic and for good reason, and many have deconstructed the game better than I ever could. It was, to repeat what is often said, a game with a lot to say and whose method of storytelling is uniquely told through the form of games. The feelings at play, the griefs and self-hate, and how the monsters reflected James' psyche is an intelligently designed, deliberate story. By the end, the aesthetics, music, and monster design became thoroughly cemented in my subconscious. When I played the third game, I had largely forgotten the memories connected to the first, but as I continued with the references to it, I began to remember more and more. I felt like I was following Heather on her journey to discover why the cult is pursuing her in the early acts in this way. The first and third game being so similar as well allowed me to fall into a bit of comfort in my nostalgia. Of course, the game disturbed me, but somehow it was also kind of like going to an old house you used to live, and the experiences, which once had been so intense, became echoes. I hadn't known it at the time, but it was also one of the first times I truly felt seen by media, something I wouldn't feel again for many years, nor unpack until I was much older. quickly fell in love with the game, but I couldn't necessarily pin down why that was, as I do consider Silent Hill 2 an objectively better game. Years later, in my mid-20s, with a lot more time to think about it, I think I now know why that is. It is because Silent Hill 3 is a game about trauma, a game that centralizes women in the fears they experience, the ways that the world is hostile to them, and the scars it leaves on their psyche. There are two worlds throughout the Silent Hill series. The first is akin to ours, where the other world doesn't touch. Between the mall and the sections of Heather exploring abandoned buildings, these sections harken to a similar kind of nostalgia depicted in the introduction. The underlying creepiness still remains, but it feels still somewhat comfortable. Being a child born into late capitalism, I would often explore places I shouldn't have been, and oftentimes these were places that had been closed down years ago, similar to the environments depicted in the game. I frequented many places. There was a campground nearby my house that was abandoned years ago, overtaken by vegetation. Empty, cracked parking lots late into the night were the stages of me and my friends. Caves nearby the train tracks near the ocean marked where I would spend various afternoons. I was lucky I didn't end up stepping on a rusty nail or anything. The second world, the other world as it's called, is a place that corrupts and distorts according to the fear and doubts of those who inhabit it. Each game introduces new ways for the other world to uniquely manifest based on the protagonist. Here, the game bucks its usual trend by having the protagonist's visions be introduced by both Alessa and Heather's trauma, perspective belonging to women rather than the men who typically inhabit the protagonist's role, and also being based on two different individuals. One of the first bits of evocative imagery that furthers the theme of femininity is in the restrooms. You enter, not finding much beyond some loot, but as you leave you hear a knock on one of the stalls. When Heather opens it, a toilet soaked in blood is revealed. It is as if the other world is taunting her for having a period. It highlights a twisted version of femininity that strikes fear in the process of getting older. Soon after, a hanger is also needed to progress, clearly drawing connections to abortion. The symbolism here is representative of facets of womanhood intrinsically linked to one's reproductive system. The ability to produce children becomes centralized in society by the process of getting older as a woman. The fear in this other world is a loss of personhood, replaced with an encompassing societal functions that drains the humanity of women. Hammering this point in further, Heather, though she doesn't know it yet, has already had God forcibly imposed upon her without her consent, a clear allegory to sexual assault. The other world creates distorted images of these fears, and in so doing, centralizes aspects of gender that women often find constraining. It is also in the mall section that we are introduced to the religious trauma in the game, most evidently through Claudia. She imparts to Heather the imperative of embracing her true self and leading the cult towards salvation. Despite her brief presence in the mall section, Claudia's influence endures throughout the game. The moment Claudia enters the scene, the otherworldly forces at play intensify their grip on reality, further distorting it as the game progresses. Her role as an antagonist is to force Heather to embrace the identity and belief system of the cult, which she refuses to adhere to.
Remember me, and your true self as well. Also, that which you must become. The one who will lead us to paradise with blood-stained hands.
Claudia, right? Did you do all this?
It was the hand of God.
This experience mirrors a struggle that many women often undergo in a patriarchal society. In such an environment, individuals are constantly subject to external forces that seek to control them, making resistance an almost natural state of being. Her role in the game thus highlights the universal theme of individuals being pressured to conform to beliefs and identities that may not align with their true selves. This resonates with the experience of various marginalized groups, as oftentimes aspects of identity such as gender and sexuality are subject to an almost constant scrutiny. As Heather continues in the mall section, she encounters various monsters who are reflective of Heather and Alessa's fears. One such entity is the Numbody, a pallid bipedal creature that emits cries which, to my ear, are kind of reminiscent of a newborn infant when defeated. Interestingly, Masahiro Ito, the creator, noted that the design of the numb bodies lacked any specific meaning, yet its appearance bears an uncanny resemblance to a sperm cell, hinting towards the theme of pregnancy and sex. Another foe Heather's encounters is the closers. Distinguished by their massive arms and a face that resembles a vulva, the closers likely symbolize dysmorphia. Large arms and hands, a traditionally masculine feature, being placed so close to such a direct image of femininity in the vaginal face heightens its contrast, and thus the discomfort of that dissonance. Splitworm looks like a dick. Sorry, but look at it, there's not really much else you can take from that. The splitworm probably symbolizes the concepts of pregnancy and birthing. Heather embodies these fears and anxieties surrounding the notion of having children and the responsibilities it entails.
What are you talking about? What's so special about you anyway?
If I knew that, I wouldn't be so confused, would I? But I know there's something. Something I've been running from and forgot for a long time. How did I remember that?
What's wrong?
Nothing.
After the conclusion of the mall section, Heather takes the subway home and on her way encounters an occult magazine discussing ghosts. The magazine explores the concept that ghosts are perpetually confined to reliving their final moments, trapped in an endless cycle of fear and suffering. This phenomenon bears resemblance to traumatic events, where the overwhelming intensity of these events keeps traumatized individuals bound within their memories. This concept mirrors Alessa's presence as well, as she is seldom described apart from the traumatic circumstances of her death. In the other world, her anguish echoes loudly, intertwining her pain with the very fabric of that dimension. This reflection offers a glimpse into the nature of the other world, shedding light on how it materializes and why the traumas experienced by both Heather and Alessa are so intimately intertwined in its manifestation. Another note continues the connection, noting that a man was beheaded, committing suicide on the tracks, implying in part that the following sections have ghosts which manifest similarly. If you even go to the location mentioned in the magazine, you can experience a unique cutscene where a ghostly force pushes Heather into an oncoming train, killing her instantly. Minmo is here as well, which is fantastic news for all you Minmo heads out there. The symbolism in these sections is fairly straightforward in its meaning, but again evokes some consistent thematic lines. In terms of themes of femininity and womanhood, this section is reflected in the methods by which the other world is freed by a feminine force, and how the monsters change to represent the fears of Heather and Alessa. The insane cancer, which first appears in this section, could be connected to femininity through the comparison of cancer to pregnancy and unstoppable growth of cells. Its shape may also be interpretive aspects of one's body one may find dysmorphia in. This section also introduces the player to the Slurper, who crawls around on the floor not unlike a toddler. Their symbolism is, once more, evocative yet somewhat vague. They could be interpreted as Heather's fear of motherhood, and this is especially backed up by its design being influenced by the Kakai of Japanese mythology, known for resembling newborns with deformed features. The following sewer section contains a creature that will kill you if you don't throw a blow dryer into the water to electrocute it. It has allusions to the sexual undertones, as the creature is comprised of tentacles, and allusions to a method of suicide with the blow dryer in the water. Following this, as Heather traverses through Hilltop Center, we are introduced to Vincent. He seems to find an obsession with the other world, an acceptance and joy, almost sexual pleasure with trauma and pain. It's ambiguous whether Heather and Vincent are seeing the same reality or experiencing the same things. He is an enigmatic presence, often lying and purposely confusing the narrative.
So Harry didn't tell you anything. I guess he hid the truth to keep you on his side, eh? That figures. He's a pretty sneaky guy.
Don't talk about my dad like that!
sorry. I apologize. Please, calm down.
How do you know my father anyway?
I know everything. I know about your past, too.
Then tell me what's going on.
You don't know even that?
That's why I'm asking. If you know everything, then tell me how I can put an end to this.
Not yet. Why not enjoy yourself a bit longer?
Enjoy? I feel like I'm going crazy. Doesn't this place get to you at all?
Oh, it gets to me all right. I find it most fascinating.
Vincent, standing in a psychiatrist's office when you first find him, is a strong representation of psychiatry, linking some fears of uncertainty to Heather. Individuals like Vincent carry with them a sense of intelligence and control, convincing Heather to doubt herself and what she sees, even her own motivations. The influence of a malformed version of psychiatry and religion act as the primary antagonistic forces, whose expectations on Heather are to undergo drastic physical changes against her will. As teenagers rarely have the last say in what happens to them once authority figures get involved, it's not hard to draw connections to bills attempting to strip trans teens of their bodily autonomy, to the feeling of Heather attempting to define her own body in the face of external pressures. Nearby, in the same building, there is an accompanying fairy tale that promises to open the exit, one which sparks a memory in Heather that she had borrowed the same book in her past. The writing in it is strange, however, as if it wasn't a fairy tale, but something written by a child. Which is strange considering she got it from a library. The meaning of this will be elucidated later, but for now it is a key bit of foreshadowing. In the story, a town's gate is blocked by a monster. The king and his men attempt to use violence to get through, but nothing they do works. They enlist the help of a young girl who, instead of force, tries using words to make the monster go away. She tries convincing it and intimidating it, but the monster attacks, killing her. The town enters a period of mourning, but she soon manages to resurrect. She approaches the monster and instead tries a spell which effectively banishes the monster with tu fui ego eris. The monster blocking the exit, the glutton, vanishes with these words, and Heather is able to continue to her apartment. Here, she will encounter something that changes the core direction of Silent Hill 3. As a trans woman, I find these representations of femininity to be surprisingly refreshing. It's rare for games, and media more generally, to put the experience of women at the forefront. In playing Silent Hill 3 as a pre-transition kid, I hadn't known what about the other world clicked so well for me, but I think that the representations of femininity are aspects which I find fear in as well. I frequently will find dysphoria in that I can't have periods nor give birth, and sexual assault is as big a fear in trans women as in cis women. It accentuates a tangible biological difference from cisgender women. A reminder that my body doesn't align with what society traditionally associates with womanhood. Silent Hill 3 is arguably not explicitly queer in any sort of way, but I would argue that the symbolic nature of the otherworld, among other aspects, lends credence to the queer reading. These fears in the game, being so centralized on experiences associated with gender, are relatable in that gender is so constraining and terrifying to everybody, but especially for trans and non-binary people. By looking at the game through such a lens, one can see a game which in its messaging both understands the difficulty of coping with a gendered world as somebody who doesn't fit in the binary and provides a positive outlook on living with such feelings. In media, queerness is often painted as a constant struggle, a pain that is somehow inherent to the queer experience, a need to fight to be able to express aspects of oneself. However, I think that tends to create the association of queerness and pain, as if it is some kind of barrier one must pass. We all experience pain, queer or not. Perhaps it is less that suffering is inherent to the queer experience, but that suffering is inherent to the human experience. Horror as a medium, especially when it centers marginalized communities, allows one to step into the shoes of people unfamiliar to themselves and use that perspective to better inform their worldview. It's a genre often open to audience interpretation, their errant thoughts about what could be around the corner often scarier than reality, and in part becoming what one remembers about the work. Silent Hill as a series understands and plays into how that fear manifests, creating a world that often shifts between the real and the other world, and in Centralizing Trauma understands the way one's brain can twist and deform reality while turning seemingly ordinary things into nightmarish reflections. However, there's a key distinction between utilizing queer trauma as a theme and using it as shock. As much as I think Last of Us 2 is a lovely work of art, for example, Lev's dead name and repeated misgenderings were not something that needed to be explicitly included. It would seem that these moments were less for the sake of saying something about the kind of pressures being put on trans individuals and more as a way for the audience to feel sympathy, to motion towards the audience that his queerness exists. Little more thought than that is given to his transness, and that suffering is on full display, as is the lesbian relationship between Ellie and Dina. Although the game is purposefully a tragedy and often relies on suffering as a central theme, the fact that queer suffering comprises a large portion of the game, predominantly written by a non-queer staff, reads as doing little with the theme. In contrast, something like, say, April Daniels' Dreadnought, admittedly a far more lighthearted piece, includes trans suffering as a key plot point. She does not, however, conclude with that suffering, but shows the joys in expressing one's gender, the euphoria of finally being free. Silent Hill 3's narrative conceptualizes queer suffering similarly, and allows for conclusions to be drawn from its themes that showcase not only the difficulties we experience, but the possibility and hope of making it through. Oftentimes, that hope can be more than enough. As Mia Violet writes in Yes, You Are Trans Enough, a common effect of dysphoria is that it places a cap to your emotions and tricks you into confusing contentedness for happiness. It tells you that being numb and dissatisfied with everything is the normal way to be. I spent 22 years before I transitioned wallowing in a destructive relationship. And if there's one thing I wish I could have told myself, it's not that things are going to get better, but that you have to make it so. I struggle almost daily having been raised the way I did with things that seem simple for other people, but I hold to that kind of hope, that knowledge that things are going to improve, because it will before, and with effort, it will again.
Oh. Dad, I'm home. Listen, something really crazy's going on. I think we should... Dad? Dad?
Harry Mason's death is a tragic and sudden turning point for the narrative. This moment provides context for the previous book, as it would seem as if the book was written by Claudia, given the revelation that Harry's death occurred soon after Heather left the Hilltop Center, and the characters aligned to Claudia's self-conception. Harry in the book serves as the obstacle blocking their path, the townspeople representing the various monsters of Silent Hill trying to escape into the real world. The woman in the story was defeated and resurrected, as was Claudia herself, and the barrier keeping the monsters, including what alludes to be God as the king, from the other world apart. Harry. Heather, after his death, stands as the only thing remaining between the other worlds entering the real. Now is a good time as ever to introduce the symbolic nature of the glutton. The creature seems to reside bound within a cage, with a dial twisting in his chest. Some figure this creature alludes to the female anatomy, but I'm more subscribed to it being a vision of Harry preventing the other world from spreading further. I think that it may be in part Heather's fear of the expectation she put on her father, as if Heather knows her past may eventually catch up with her. Found in Harry's diary, I sometimes have the sense that even now that girl is a reincarnation of Alessa. I don't worry about it much now. That's all forgiven. You were in love, Cheryl. Or was that Alessa? Now Cheryl is Alessa again. No matter whose reincarnation she may have been, that girl was my most beloved treasure. But that name was a mistake. At the time, I thought of her only as a replacement for my lost Cheryl. When she knows the truth, will she feel bad? That's what worries me. In this letter, it's revealed that Harriet felt trapped by the complexity of coping with what happened after the events of the first game. The glutton's name is perhaps representative of the way Heather fears Harry sees her, a gluttonous entity draining his normalcy and putting a target on his back. It could also be representative of Claudia's version of him, just as a barrier to be circumvented or an obstacle to be overcome. The missionary, further, is a boss who, in its name, hints towards an attempt by Claudia to forcefully convert Heather, and in its surgical tire, reflects Alessa's charger. Based on its design and Harry's past, it can be assumed that the attack on him was a surprise, and Claudia knows Heather can easily kill the monster in return, but simply doesn't care. She just wants to stoke her flames further, never allowing Heather the possibility to escape, giving her motivation to participate in the ritual. After the fight, Douglas arrives, and he and Heather discuss their next steps. Heather, barely given any time to understand what just happened, seeks revenge for the death of her father, and Douglas, largely confused, receives Heather's backstory, ostensibly just a summary of the first game. It's in these moments that Heather comes fully into understanding, the veil of uncertainty of her past lifting and providing motivation for the second half of the game. She makes the decision to reclaim her identity in ways which Alessa never was able to. She must contend with many of the forces queer people come to face, placed between authenticity and the will of authority. By choosing to fight, Heather chooses to live authentically and deny the will of authority to accept an identity she does not adhere to. The game takes an intriguing narrative approach by introducing the titular city of Silent Hill relatively late in the game. Traditionally, the town is introduced at the outset of the games and is central to the unfolding of the plot. In Silent Hill 3, however, this formula is subverted and the town becomes accessible only midway through the game. This decision has significant narrative and thematic implications as it serves as a turning point for Heather as she gradually regains control and clarity over her circumstances. Rather than the central hub of the previous two games, the town seems to serve more as a transitional space, through which Heather is able to track down Claudia and Vincent, though it is still fascinating to explore, especially with familiarity in the series. There's a whole lot of fun Easter eggs around here, and I encourage you to explore. After exploring the streets of Silent Hill, Heather arrives at Brookhaven Hospital. The hospital serves as a pivotal location, echoing the themes of control, authority, and the interplay of identity and trauma represented in the first half of the game. Heather is now entering an institution known for its associations with institutionalization. It's a place where the line between patient and prisoner blurs, where the patients are meant to doubt themselves and their reality. In Brookhaven, she is also stalked by Stanley Coleman.
Today is your 24th birthday, and I have a present for you. Which do you prefer? To give pain or to receive it? You can have the one you hate the most. Happy birthday to you!
Stanley is perhaps the most psychologically horrifying character in the game, serving as an unseen observer who only appears physically as a corpse. The terror in being stalked by him stems not only from the violation of the player's privacy, as you are observed without consent by an unwelcome presence, but also from the uncertainty of when and how these intrusions occur, which is never revealed. This perpetual state of paranoia pervades the player's experience in the coming section. The image Stanley creates is a distorted vision of Heather, harkening back to aspects of herself that are more representative of Alessa than herself, if anyone, as he rarely even mentions why his obsession with Heather exists. Perhaps the only moment in which he mentions something about Heather is when he mentions her ebony hair, even though Heather has since dyed it blonde. In Stanley's vision, much like Claudia's before him, Heather represents an entity that no longer exists, a spectral figure of a girl long deceased, whom the cult continues to fervently revere. His declaration of a willingness to mutilate his own body in her stead underscores the depth of his fixation. Heather here is forced to confront the manifestations of the cult's obsession with her past that twist her identity and memory. The lies one tells himself to make sense of their actions continues to be a strong theme throughout the rest of the game. The cult and many of the characters seen throughout the game turn away from evidence directly in front of them. Heather expresses her frustration at not being able to convince Claudia and Vincent that they aren't ushering anything good in, but their delusions have gone so far as to force them into dissonance. Disconnected between actions and motivations, they assume that those who doubt them are unbelievers or somehow morally objectionable. Heather, in this scene where her reflection is distorted, reads further into this, as if she is doubting who she is, her selfhood slowly being stripped away.
Claudia is your daughter?
Oh, so you know her, do you? Are you one of her followers?
No, never. When I find her, I
can feel the hatred.
What?
Behind your words, the anger. You plan to kill her, don't you?
I'm sorry, but she killed my father.
She's a fool, but she's still my daughter. I was going to forgive her if she changed her ways, but I see it's too late.
Leonard Wolf's presence throughout Brookhaven Hospital offers a change of perspective on Claudia and the cult. A supposed devout believer, he decides that Claudia doesn't have their best interest at heart. While they share their religious beliefs, their paths diverge dramatically. Leonard perceives Claudia's approach as hasty and reckless, with an apparent disregard for the destruction and suffering left in the wake of her actions. Claudia, on the other hand, ends up replicating many of the behaviors Leonard used to abuse her, projecting that trauma and twisting the other world in her vision. The relationship is symbolic for the cycle of abuse, how Leonard's behaviors and beliefs are imparted onto Claudia, and how Claudia's self-deception has prevented her from seeing the effects of her actions. Vincent worsens this, as after Leonard's death, he tells her that she wanted him to suffer the same way she did, pushing her even further away from the possibility of stopping the ritual. He states, "What you call faith is nothing more than a child crying out for love." And while that may be somewhat an accurate depiction of Claudia's belief, it comes at a moment where Claudia is experiencing the complicated emotions associated with losing an abusive family member. In saying it, Vincent unwittingly pushes her further into her self-destructive spiral by giving her a solid argument to work against. The statement taps into Claudia's inner conflict, the desire for love and validation that was painfully absent from her abusive relationship with her father, and the actions she's taking to compensate. Heather is the only character able to tangibly break the cycle, deciding consciously to reject what they want out of her. Her reaction is generally one of ambivalence to attempts to change her, relying on her intrinsic sense of reality and selfhood. The somewhat stiff, awkward dialogue the series is known for in this entry serves to depict every character as having one step out of reality. For Claudia and Vincent, their dissociation is one of denial and inability to accept reality. While for Heather, she seems to use that disconnection to retain her sanity in the face of trauma. This contrast in how the characters cope with their past and the cult's influence highlights the diverse ways individuals respond to the trauma and the legacy of abuse. The queer experience is often marred by similar experiences, with dissociation being a common form of coping that many queer individuals adopt when they find themselves in the closet, attempting to retain a sense of normalcy in the face of a world that conflicts with who they are. Needing to hide one's gender or sexuality is an isolating, demoralizing experience, and while that feeling can be tangibly felt while viewing the expectations of Heather to be Alessa, for her traumatic past to define her rather than a future she would pave for herself. This process of defining oneself in the face of opposition can be inherently traumatic. To cut ties with an abusive family member like Claudia, even if they are toxic, means to also sever important resources such as access to food, housing, and emotional support. The stalking of Stanley Coleman in this section serves as a reflection of the difficulties many queer individuals face in real life and intrusion during vulnerable moments. Claudia's insistence that Heather is not the person they claim to be reflects the constant doubt that pushes queer people back into heteronormativity. The experience of being pursued and doubted in such a way can be emotionally and psychologically taxing, making it harder to assert one's identity and live authentically. Heather's self-acceptance and the courage to forge one's own path, even when the world tries to force them into roles that no longer fit, resonates with the challenges that many queer individuals confront on their own journeys towards self-discovery and acceptance. Upon Heather's arrival at the amusement park, a recurrence of her earlier nightmare ensues. Within this section, the game deliberately injects a dose of campy horror elements to provide players with a brief respite before the climactic final act. During her exploration, Heather stumbles upon a puzzle that revolves around two fairy tales, Snow White and Cinderella. These tales carry connections that bear significance to both Heather and Alessa. Snow White is renowned for her eternal slumber, awaiting true love's kiss to awaken her, while Cinderella's fairy godmother is famous for using magic to transform reality. Interpreting this puzzle, we can see Snow White as a representation of Alessa, or the god itself, trapped in a perpetual slumber and awaiting for some form of salvation or resolution. Conversely, Cinderella embodies Heather, who possesses the power to reshape and manipulate the world around her, much like Cinderella's fairy godmother, who, with magic, redefines her perceived class. Following the sequence, a vision of Alessa attacks Heather. During the battle, Heather grapples with a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, she feels sympathy with Alessa, a girl who tragically met her end through no fault of her own. She simply yearns for another chance at life. On the other hand, she experiences fear, a fear that stems from the possibility of Alessa's influence overwhelming her. This is exacerbated by the striking physical resemblance between the two, further blurring the line between them. Ultimately, as Heather vanquishes this symbolic representation of Alessa, she reaches a realization. While they may share memories, it becomes apparent that they are fundamentally distinct individuals. This moment of reckoning is undeniably challenging, as it forces Heather to grapple between the dichotomy between expectations and authenticity. This complex choice, epitomized by Heather's eternal struggle, finds resonance in the experiences of trans folks and their relationships with their past selves. Trans people often find themselves in situations where they must conceal their true identity for the sake of personal safety. The person they remember from their past can hardly be regarded as their genuine self, but rather reflections of the expectations placed upon them, shaped not by the choice, but by circumstance. Revisiting that reflection, fraught with imperfections and expectations, can be a daunting and at times traumatic process, serving as a poignant reminder of the distance traveled. The act of looking back at the person once was becomes a transformative and often emotionally charged experience, as it highlights the stark contrast between the person you were expected to be and the person you've authentically become. The cult's religious beliefs are further examined in the narrative, beginning with Douglas's confrontation of Claudia. The central tenet of the cult's faith revolves around the concept of paradise, a place devoid of negative emotions where eternal bliss is the prevailing state. However, Heather challenges this notion upon her arrival at the church.
Listen, suffering is a fact of life. Either you learn how to deal with that or you go under. You can stay in your own little dream world, but you can't keep hurting other people. Besides, I'll never forgive you for hurting my father.
Claudia's idealistic vision of a world devoid of suffering fails to account for the intrinsic duality of human experience. By negating the contrast between positive and negative emotions, the result is a world devoid of depth and emotional richness. In such a world, eternal happiness is not a source of joy, but rather a numbing neutrality. The absence of suffering negates the very foundation of human emotion and experience. In her conversation with Vincent, Heather confronts the fact that, despite sharing the same religious affiliation, their motivations diverge significantly. Vincent, even while delivering his iconic line, "They look like monsters to you," displays an unmistakable fascination and pleasure with the other world. He may not perceive the entities in the same way as others, but it is still evidence that he recognizes them as the monstrous reflection of Alessa's psyche. His perspective leans more toward viewing these creatures as subjects of scientific inquiry and fascination. As importantly, he does not describe them as human or endowed with emotions. Rather, he finds more enjoyment and satisfaction in the study and understanding of their existence. Vincent's character represents the polar opposite of Claudia's viewpoint. He derives happiness from the very experience of trauma, taking pleasure in the examination of pain and the mysteries of the other world. This stark contrast in their perspective shadows the multifaceted nature of human reactions to suffering and trauma. Heather occupies a middle ground between these extremes. She understands that life is inherently bound to suffering, but also believes that it doesn't have to be solely defined by pain. To exist is to endure hardship, but more importantly, it is to overcome and emerge stronger. She encapsulates the idea that dwelling in perpetual suffering is akin to a self-inflicted death, emphasizing the importance of resilience and growth in the face of life's inevitable challenges.
No, I don't expect to be saved. And that's fine. Alessa, my dearest. For the pain that I've caused you, I deserve no mercy. Alessa, what have you done? What did you swallow? Stop! God is... Claudia! Oh. Alessa, you cannot kill God.
These allegorical elements convey a profound rejection of religious pressures and, simultaneously, an affirmation of Heather's individuality. In response, Claudia, gripped by fanaticism and determination, chooses to swallow the fetus. Falling into a nearby vaginal hole, the imagery takes on characteristics of a pregnancy allegory, suggesting of birthing or rebirth. The ultimate confrontation with the game's final boss, the half-formed god, unfolds with the symbolism of motherhood at its core. In devouring Claudia, the god, incomplete in its manifestation, underscores the idea that motherhood can sometimes entail the loss of self while nurturing a child. The irony of the situation lies in God feasting upon the very entity responsible for bringing it into existence. Throughout the game and Claudia's life, it becomes apparent that her identity had been gradually consumed by this malevolent entity. The god, with its half-formed skeletal appearance and its resemblance to Alessa in her dying moments, is far from an angelic or benevolent entity. It represents a twisted amalgamation of Alessa, Heather, and Claudia's toxic relationship, a grotesque being, half alive, consuming the corpse of its mother. Heather, in a metaphorical act of severance, cuts the god off halfway through its manifestation, and it eventually succumbs to the 5-minute onslaught of bullets. Heather's transformation reaches its climax as she turns away from the lifeless form of the god, the embodiment of her torment. In the aftermath of the battle, her emotions, once fueled by rage and vengeance, dissipate like a passing storm, leaving behind a void, an emotional hollow where the memory of a person once existed. This pivotal moment of the narrative is both heart-wrenching and profound. Heather, emotionally depleted and spiritually worn down by her journey, collapses to her knees. In her solitude, she begins to sob, a raw and unfiltered release of emotions. It's a moment of introspection and painful vulnerability, a stark contrast to the fierce determination that had carried her through the nightmarish trials of Silent Hill. As the sobs echo in the silent, desolate church, Heather's psyche grapples with the weight of the past, the trauma she's endured, and the cathartic resolution of her mission.
Is that the end? I guess it's time to roll the credits. Dad! Dad!
With Douglas by her side, Heather makes her way out of the amusement park. It is an act of closure, a resolute step away from the ordeal. In doing so, the game concludes on a moment of exploration of the effect of trauma. Heather's story serves as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the struggle for self-identity, and the enduring pursuit of one's truth. It is a journey fraught with symbolism, confronting players with the darkness that resides within and the courage required to navigate it. The conclusion of the game felt hollow when I first played it. I couldn't piece together why it ends so abruptly. In part, I believe that is why it stuck so well in my memory, like a song you don't hear the conclusion to, repeating the same incomplete chorus. One explanation can be placed on how rushed the game was during development. However, I find that the conclusion lends itself to an important reading, one that allows Heather, now calling herself Cheryl, to define her own future. The game, in concluding on this note, draws attention once more to the trans reading, wherein the ultimate decision of deciding her true self is by claiming ownership over her own name. She retains her blonde hair though, a piece of her identity that she now has autonomy over and can decide to keep. If this piece receives any sort of attention, I am certain of one criticism in particular, and would like to address this in advance: the assertion that there is no explicit queer representation in this work. To this, I'd like to note that this is entirely interpretive. Further, I'm not of the belief that any text is defined by what was intended by the creator. In interpreting art, one is inherently bringing their own unique perspectives. How one sees and what one takes away from art is not a static thing, but a fluid and ever-changing process, defined by various perspectives from the context you experience it to the kind of media that inspired it. Others have interpreted Silent Hill 3 on a more objective level, if such a thing exists, highlighting connections to femininity, and have come to similar conclusions on the meaning. I think all those takes are important and have been key in the writing of this, but I feel like taking an approach with a queer perspective in mind highlights how much Silent Hill 3 is about the expectations to conform placed on teenagers from adults in prominent positions of power. So yes, there may not be much evidence hinting to an explicit queer reading, but through interpretations through a queer lens, I think the game is saying a great deal of things about cycles of abuse and compulsory conformity and the influence of trauma. Heather's story is one about contending with the past. She confronts the source of her trauma, and in so doing is able to define herself, yet brings on an unexpected tragedy. Perhaps this is why a queer reading of this game resonates so thoroughly with me. I have heard the same story of parents who, upon discovering their child's queerness, abandon them or push them back into the closet or just generally increase their abuse over and over again. In such a situation, it can seem as if the world is changing against you, that your safety is being stripped from you, that it is a hopeless and desperate struggle. Doing the right thing can often be a painful process, and freedom must regularly be fought for if you're queer. After all that, though, it's more than worth it.